Have you ever found yourself, needing really reliable medical information? Maybe you're making a big health decision or you just want to get how scientific claims are actually checked out.
Mm,
It's this search for trustworthy knowledge, right? Especially now with information everywhere. And
absolutely.
that search is really what our deep dive is all about today.
Yeah, exactly. We're going to pull back the curtain a bit on medical research, specifically looking at randomized clinical trials, RCTs, and maybe surprisingly, some real challenges to how trustworthy they are.
Our main source for this is a pretty powerful review. It's from the Middle East Fertility Society Journal, just out this year, 2024. But colleagues wrote it.
Right.
And the title kind of says it all, The Randomized Clinical Trial Trustworthiness Crisis.
It really does. And our mission today, essentially, is to unpack why this supposed gold standard of medical evidence is under the microscope. What does that mean for evidence-based medicine? And really importantly, what are researchers doing to try and rebuild that trust?
Okay, so let's start there. The gold standard. What exactly are randomized clinical trials? Why did they get this, top-tier reputation in medicine?
Well, RCTs are basically the bedrock of evidence-based medicine,
Hmm.
EBM as it's known. It's this whole approach of using the best evidence we have to make clinical decisions.
Okay.
Think of it like a pyramid or a hierarchy of evidence quality. RCTs, they sit right at the very top. Their design, it's specifically set up to give valid, reliable evidence by minimizing things like bias and confounding factors.
And they're just so important, aren't they? I mean, figuring out if a new drug works, getting it approved, pinpointing the best treatment for
That's
patients.
very crucial.
They give us those insights into cause and effect that are just so hard to get otherwise. We saw how vital they were during the whole COVID-19 response, didn't we?
We definitely did. But, and this is the core issue, this foundation, this bedrock, it's showing some pretty significant cracks lately. The main problem, as our source points out, is we're seeing more and more RCTs being retracted,
Mhm.
pulled back. And that's creating this, well, this very real worry about their trustworthiness. It's quite concerning.
That is concerning. And this worry, it seems, has actually led some people to look more towards non-randomized studies using things like electronic health records, this real-world data.
That's right.
I mean, I get the appeal. Everything's digital now, right? Every clinic visit is recorded, so the data is just
Yeah.
there. It seems so accessible. But if RCTs are the best, why look elsewhere?
Yeah, observational studies look like they could be substitutes, mainly because that data is so easy to get hold of.
Huh?
But, and this is the critical point, they have what our source calls inherent biases.
Ah,
These biases fundamentally put them, well, a notch below randomized evidence. Just getting more observational data doesn't fix the bias problem. It boosts statistical power, sure, but not the underlying validity.
so bigger isn't automatically better?
Exactly. And the source warns that if we just abandon RCTs for this easily accessible data, we risk going backwards, reverting to the pre-EBM research era. That could lead to a lot of false conclusions based on statistics.
That sounds like a really dangerous step back. But are there times when observational studies are genuinely useful, even with those biases?
Oh, definitely. They're incredibly valuable when you just can't randomize.
Yeah.
Think about researching very rare diseases, maybe, or studying things in emergency situations. Or sometimes there isn't an intervention involved that could easily mess up the results.
Okay, so specific situations.
Right. And in those cases, researchers can use clever statistical methods, like propensity scores, for instance.
The propensity score.
Yeah, think of it as a statistical way to kind of mimic randomization after the fact. It helps adjust for those potential confounding factors by creating groups that look more similar, making the study findings a bit more robust in those contexts where RCTs aren't an option.
Got it. Okay, so RCTs are crucial, but their trustworthiness is being questioned. Let's get into the weeds of this crisis. What are the actual problems affecting RCT integrity?
Our source points to a few things happening within the trial. Sometimes it's honest errors, genuine mistakes.
Hmm.
But then there are more serious issues. Things like actual data manipulation, lapses in professionalism, and just poor methodological shortcomings. Problems right at the source.
And then there's this whole pressure system around publishing, right? The
Yeah.
numbers you mentioned are kind of wild. Like 125 trials started every day, but only about 75 get published.
That's the estimate, yeah. Which means something like 40% of trials that get started just disappear. They never see the light of day.
Wow.
And it's worse than that even. About 5% of trials that are registered never actually begin, and somewhere between, say, 12% and 28% just get stopped early.
So all that potentially useful medical knowledge just vanishes, never gets to doctors or patients. That seems like a huge waste.
It is a huge waste, and it connects directly to this publish or perish mentality in academia. The whole system often values the sheer number of publications above almost anything else. It's how researchers are often judged. And this creates, frankly, tremendous pressure.
And that pressure leads to?
Well, unfortunately, it can incentivize some researchers to, as the source puts it, actively cheat or purposely remove data just to get papers out faster.
That's grim. And then there's publication bias itself, isn't there? Journals preferring the good news stories.
Exactly. Journals tend to want positive findings, results showing a treatment worked or there was a significant difference, which means scientifically solid studies that find no effect, these null results, or studies that just replicate earlier findings. They often don't get published. They aren't seen as exciting.
So that skews the whole picture.
It totally skews the picture.
Yeah.
It unintentionally encourages people to chase those positive results, maybe even leads to spurious findings and false positives, because that's what gets rewarded.
And this problem doesn't just stop at individual trials, right? It affects systematic reviews, too. The ones that are supposed to pull all the evidence together.
Precisely. Systematic reviews are vital. They're meant to synthesize all the RCT evidence on a topic to guide health policy and clinical practice.
Yeah.
But if the trials they include are flawed, the review itself will be flawed.
Makes sense.
And our source points out that some reviews have led to bad outcomes. Unreliable guidelines, lapses in regulation, and tardiness in removing hazardous drugs.
And the real-world impact.
Things like elevated treatment expenses, unnecessary medical procedures, even overdiagnosis and overtreatment. And get this, over 50,000 systematic reviews were published in 2022 alone.
50,000.
Yeah. So you can see why having validated ways to check the integrity of these reviews is absolutely critical. The ripple effect of bad information at that scale is just immense.
At scale is, yeah, it's kind of staggering. And this integrity issue, it seems to connect to a bigger problem in science. Generally reproducibility. This replication riddle. It's not just medicine, apparently. And the statistic you shared earlier is pretty shocking. 70% of researchers have tried to duplicate another scientist's findings, but failed. That really shakes your faith in how science is supposed to work, doesn't it?
It's a major concern. And what's really interesting is that replication, repeating someone else's experiment to see if you get the same result, was seen as absolutely fundamental way back when the Royal Society started in, 1660?
Wow, that far back.
Yeah. But somewhere along the line, we lost interest. Journals today want novelty, new findings, things that get cited a lot. Replication studies often just don't make the cut, even though they're essential for confirming results are real.
And it's not just lack of interest. There are practical hurdles, too, like not being able to get the original data.
Exactly. Often the raw data isn't shared publicly, or the detailed methods, the protocol, the statistical code, it's just not available. So even if you wanted to reanalyze the published data to check it, you often can't.
Which leads to just having to take published findings on faith, more or less.
Pretty much. It can lead to a kind of blind acceptance because verification is impossible. And then, layered on top of that, is the whole issue of how statistics get used, or maybe misused.
Ah, statistical shenanigans, as the outline called it.
Right. Statistical analysis can be tricky. It can be misused, as the source says, intentionally as a kind of fraud, or unintentionally as a kind of illusion.
How so?
Well, researchers often have a lot of choices to make when they analyze data. Different valid approaches can sometimes lead to quite different results, even contradictory ones, from the same data set. And then there's the specific problem of making big claims based on subgroup analysis without doing the proper statistical checks beforehand.
Subgroup analysis. Remind me why that's tricky. It sounds like looking deeper into the data, which seems good.
It can be good if planned properly, but subgroup analysis is looking at smaller groups within the main study, like did the drug work better for men than women, or older versus younger people. The problem comes when researchers kind of go fishing for a positive result in one small subgroup after they've already run the main analysis, especially if they didn't plan to look at that specific subgroup from the start.
Ah, like data dredging.
Exactly. You can almost always find some subgroup that looks like it had a significant result just by chance. Especially if you look at enough subgroups, it can make a weak or non-existent effect look real. It's a classic way to generate false positives.
Right, okay. It's like finding a pattern in random noise if you look hard enough. So all of this, the lack of access, the potential for statistical misuse, it really highlights the debate around data sharing, doesn't it?
It absolutely does.
Our source mentions this ethical obligation to share data from trials, especially because participants put themselves on the line. Where do things stand with that?
Well, it's been a bit of a back and forth. The International Committee of Medical Journal Editors, the ICMJE, they initially floated a proposal to make de-identified patient data publicly available within 6 months of publication. That was pretty bold.
Sounds good. What happened?
They actually withdrew that specific proposal after some pushback. Later, they came back with a revised recommendation. Now, journals often require authors to include a data sharing plan when they register the study.
So, a plan, but not necessarily open data for everyone.
Right. It's a step towards transparency, but it's not full open access.
Mm.
And our source is quite clear that this current limitation on openness ought to be reconsidered in the near future. There's definitely a push for more sharing.
Okay, so we've laid out a lot of the problems contributing to this, well, this crisis of trust. The really big question is, what can we actually do about it? How do we start rebuilding that trust?
Our source outlines several key pathways forward. It really starts with improving how RCTs are designed and actually run.
Like what specifically?
Well, first off, making sure the research questions being asked are actually relevant, that they matter to patients and the public. Patient involvement in designing trials is becoming much more important.
Okay, good start.
Then, crucially, pre-registering the trial protocol, the detailed plan, and making it public before any participants are even recruited. That locks in the plan up front.
No moving the goalposts later.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then, actually conducting the trial according to that plan, avoiding deviations. Proper randomization methods and making sure allocation is concealed, meaning the researchers don't know who's getting which treatment. Those are absolutely fundamental to prevent bias.
Right.
And maybe one of the most critical points, the analysis strategy needs to be decided and documented before anyone looks at the outcome data. No p-hacking or fishing for results afterward.
But transparency about funding.
Definitely. Detailed reporting of who funded the trial and any potential conflicts of interest is essential. Plus, there's now this international multi-stakeholder statement specifically on integrity in RCTs, which helps set standards.
Now, you mentioned something really intriguing earlier, artificial intelligence. How might AI actually help improve RCT integrity?
Yeah, this is a really interesting area. Certain AI tools could potentially make a big difference. For instance, AI might help identify and select patients who are most likely to meet the trial's eligibility criteria and perhaps respond to the treatment.
How would that help integrity?
Well, if you can select patients more precisely, you might increase the expected effect size. That could mean you need a smaller sample size for the trial, which makes it faster, cheaper, and maximizes statistical power.
Ah, efficiency.
Efficiency, yes. And AI could also potentially be used during peer review or when someone's critically appraising a published trial. It could scan for statistical anomalies or inconsistencies that might suggest problems. But this really depends on developing and crucially validating accurate AI-driven tests for integrity. We're not quite there yet across the board.
Which brings us back to those integrity tests. Our source noted that the current ones aren't fully validated yet. That seems like a big hurdle.
It is. Getting those tests properly validated is a major priority. And this ties into another key solution proposed, meta-research.
Meta-research, like research about research.
Exactly that. It's defined as a systematic study of the research itself as the object of investigation. So researchers study how research is planned, conducted, reported, evaluated, the whole ecosystem.
What's the goal there?
The goal is basically to improve the whole scientific process, to enhance the efficiency, credibility, and quality standards by finding the flaws, understanding why they happen, and developing practical solutions. It's science turning the lens on itself to get better.
That sounds incredibly important. So pulling these threads together, the source talks about a triad needed for progress.
Yes, it emphasizes this critical triad that needs to happen all at once. Data sharing, integrity test validation, and stop the blame game.
Stop the blame game.
Yeah, basically cautioning that while we need integrity checks, using them irresponsibly could unfairly damage the reputations of honest researchers. It needs to be a constructive process, not just finger-pointing, finding solutions together.
Okay, so let's try to wrap this up. It feels like we've covered a lot of ground. The takeaway seems to be that, yes, randomized clinical trials are still considered the gold standard for figuring out if treatments work.
They absolutely are, for making robust inferences about clinical effectiveness.
That their trustworthiness has genuinely been shaken. We've talked about internal flaws, data issues, huge pressures from the academic system. It's a complex picture.
It really is a whole web of interconnected issues.
But the message isn't to just ditch RCTs, is it? The path forward seems to be about fixing them, making them better.
Exactly. It's about enhancing their relevance to patients, really pushing for better reproducibility, being much more transparent, and using these specific integrity frameworks designed for research. The source is clear. RCTs remain the cornerstone of progress when executed ethically and rigorously.
When executed ethically and rigorously. That's the key phrase.
Hmm.
Which leaves us, and you listening, with maybe one final thought to chew on. Given all these efforts underway to boost transparency and integrity in the research that underpins medicine, what's our role in all this? What responsibility do we have as people who consume this information to critically look at the evidence that shapes how we think about health?